We're coming up on Lent, and that means we're wrapping up this series on the Kingdom of Heaven, which is on the Sermon on the Mount. We have this week, and then next Sunday will be our last Sunday in the Sermon on the Mount. And then we're going to look at the next 7 weeks really being, 6 weeks being about looking and journeying with Jesus in his journey towards the cross and towards the empty grave. And so if you're a little bit curious, like what is this Ash Wednesday stuff? What is this Lent stuff? We're going to walk you through a bunch of that and hopefully give you some good resources and invite you along with us as we do that in that season. That's part of what's coming up. Also in that Lenten season, we're excited more about this coming in the future weeks, but we're going to have a couple guest speakers. Heather Thomas from Missio Dei, one of our sister churches in Salt Lake City, will be here to speak, and Ken Weitzma from Antioch Church in Bend is also going to join us at one point in the Lenten season. He wrote a book called The Myth of Equality, which I would highly recommend, and he's going to be here speaking about equality as it relates to racial justice and the church. And so some things to be looking forward to in kind of this end of winter, beginning of spring season here. So just want to jump right in. We are second to last week here on the Sermon on the Mount and come to a statement that Jesus makes here. We're just going to look at one verse this morning. And this statement is probably one of the most recognized statements in all of the scriptures. This is what it says, Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. One of the most memorable phrases in the Bible might even be how people who don't know Jesus in our culture actually would describe what it means to be a Christian, that it means to treat others the way that you would want to be treated. This is the golden rule, right? It is something that the culture broadly accepts, I would say. On the whole, most people would assent to this at some level and say, yes, this seems like a good standard by which to live your life, to treat other people the way in which you'd want to be treated. It's so broadly accepted that even the state of Kentucky includes it in their DMV driver's manuals. It's how it ends. Just remember, treat other drivers the way you'd want to be treated. And when you dig into, when you search, when you Google, I have to confess, I do a lot of Googling when I'm preparing a sermon. No shame in that. But when you Google the Golden Rule, actually, you find that in some form or another, the Golden Rule appears in the writings of almost every culture and religion in history. Certainly in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Confucianism, Taoism, all the isms, even in, and this one was shocking to me, but even in Wiccan writings, even in pagan writings, in their quotes from their goddesses, gods and goddesses, is something essentially very similar to this golden rule. Does this make it wrong? No. I think what this should tell us is that this is a law that's written deep on the hearts of humanity, that there's an inherent goodness in living our lives in this way, treating others the way we'd want to be treated. So much so that some might even call it a universal ethic. It's simple and it's obvious. But if it's so obvious and if it's so simple, why doesn't our culture reflect this? Why don't our politics reflect this? Why doesn't our foreign policy reflect this? Why doesn't the way that we interact in the business world reflect this? Why don't our own homes and families reflect this? Why doesn't our driving reflect this? These are some of the questions I have as I come to this text. So I think it's important for us to come to these words of Jesus, because while they are broadly accepted and while many people have said similar things, I think what Jesus is saying here is actually quite unique. And who Jesus is quite unique, and what he brings to the Golden Rule is really important. And so I think it's important for us to take a look at this. So we're just going to dive right in, and I'm going to do some kind of rapid-fire observations. We're going to talk about what the golden rule isn't and what the golden rule is. The very first point, I totally somehow didn't make it into my slides. And I'm the one who makes my own slides, so it's my fault. Jake used to be able to blame me, but this is my fault. So you're going to have to remember this one. It's not going to be on the screen for you. The golden rule isn't negative, it's positive. When we see the golden rule appear throughout history in other cultures and religions, most often it's put in this negative sense. What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man. Or Confucius said, what you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. But Jesus, when he says it, he says, whatever you do, which is a Greek word, panta, which is way more all-encompassing than whatever. Literally, in all things, in everything, in every interaction that you could imagine, in whatever you do, in whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. Which shifts this phrase to be more expansive. It's not just about the absence of doing harm to someone, but about the active seeking of good. It goes beyond do not harm to always do good. Which I think is interesting. Negative commands, I think, are easier to obey because they're quite narrow. So if I said you got to choose between these two commands, which one you're going to obey? First one is do not murder. The second one is protect all life that you come in contact with. Which one are you going to pick as easier to follow? I'm going to pick the negative one because it's narrow. It's very simple. But there's something really expansive when you put it in the positive sense that I'm going to be actively engaged in a really different way, which leads me to my second point, which will be the first point up here. It isn't passive, it's active. Because Jesus frames the golden rule positively, it naturally demands action from us. It's not about the absence of doing harm. It's about actively seeking good and the welfare of each other. It's a call to love, not just a call to avoid getting hurt. Third, it isn't an investment, it's a gift. What do I mean by this? I think in some weird way, the golden rule has kind of been twisted and turned and changed into a law of reciprocity, a law of karma. Do good things to other people because that, in the end, is what's going to come around to you. Which totally betrays the heart of the golden rule, which is to think about other people. But when we make it into a law of reciprocity, what we're actually doing is making it about ourselves. I'm going to treat you this way in hopes that you're going to turn around and treat me that way in return. It's really about me and what I want. The golden rule is not about manipulating and managing human relationships or social outcomes. Jesus says nothing about the golden rule producing a desired social effect. To think about the golden rule in this way is to betray the rule itself. Jesus didn't say, treat others the way you want to be treated so that you'll get what you want. One is selfishness kind of hidden under this false altruism. And the opposite would be true sacrificial love. What's interesting is when you look at the golden rule when it appears in the Gospel of Luke, it's surrounded by a bunch of other verses, and I just want to read some of those verses to you. This is what Jesus says in the Gospel of Luke. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray to those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who begs from you. And from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do unto them. In Luke, it's crystal clear. There's no reciprocity expected here. Love your enemies. Pray for those who abuse you. The people who take from you, give them more than what they took from you. Don't expect, when you give to somebody, don't expect anything in return. Jesus is calling us to a radical generosity. And the heart of generosity is that it's grounded in not expecting a return. The moment you expect a return, it's not generosity. It's not a gift. It's an investment. And Jesus isn't calling us into a wise social investment here with the golden rule. He's calling us to literally sell the farm. He's calling us to radical generosity in how we treat others. It's also the context in Matthew that we just came from. Remember the verses we were looking at last week? Ask and it will be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Your good Father longs to give good gifts to you. The immediate context here is one of giving and gifts, not one of expecting a return. And certainly that isn't the way that God treats us and how he loves us, only loving us expecting some kind of repayment. So the golden rule of Jesus should never be whittled down to a wise social investment, but rather an unrestrained spiritual and relational gift. So it's not negative, it's positive, it's not passive, it's active. It isn't an investment, it's a gift. Next, it isn't selfish, but it does require self-awareness. Somewhere along the way in Christianity, we got this idea, and maybe it got reinforced by some of our Reformed evangelical roots, that we got really uncomfortable with looking at ourselves. We were simply told, you're totally depraved, you're awful, you're evil, you're a worm, there's nothing good you could ever do. And you should never, under any circumstances, think about yourself. God has poured out his grace on you, which is true. And I think there's this weird consequence, this maybe unintended consequence to this being hammered into our brains. I want you to hear me clearly. Certainly, following the way of Jesus is going to call us into account. It's going to expose the places where we're broken and where we fall short. And it's important for us to admit our own brokenness, even as we confess our sins every single week. We value that. It's important for us to say, this is what's wrong with me, this is what's wrong with the world. But the unintentional consequence of this being hammered into our minds is that somehow we've become uncomfortable with looking at ourselves, or we've become uncomfortable with caring for ourselves. To spend time being self-aware seems selfish, but selfishness and self-awareness are completely different things. I had somebody come up to me after the first service and said, yeah, my definition for that would be that selfishness always takes something from someone. And to be self-aware isn't to take anything from anybody. Selfishness always costs someone something, but self-awareness doesn't. So it shouldn't be surprising that Jesus doesn't shy away from recruiting our self-image or self-care or self-awareness in creating this ethic. In order to treat people with love, Jesus tells us to access our awareness of ourselves. What would you want someone to do to you? It isn't selfishness to think this way. The golden rule is actually a summary of a slightly longer response that we see Jesus make. Somebody asking him about what are the greatest commandments, and he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself, which assumes that we have a sense of self, that this sense of self, even though sinful and broken, is actually made in the image of God and has value. This made me think of a song by a singer-songwriter that I like. His name's Andrew Peterson, and he wrote this song for his 12-year-old daughter. And in talking about writing the song, he said, I came home one night, and my 12-year-old daughter was really upset about something. And she was emotional and upset, like sometimes 12-year-old girls can be sometimes. And he said, it was fascinating. I watched her be so upset about this one thing, this thing that had happened, and then there was this slow turn where it went from being something that she was upset about and angry towards to where it had shifted all inward and had become something where she was upset and angry with herself and taking it out on herself. And he said to her, you need to be kind to yourself. And so he wrote this song by this same title. And he spent some time praying for her, and he went to bed, and he went back to his bedroom, and his wife had been eavesdropping on the conversation. And she said, I hope you were listening to what you said to your daughter. I hope you're willing to take your own advice. Because I say this to you all the time, and you don't ever listen to me. You need to be kind. You need to be kind to yourself. You're awfully hard on yourself. And these are the words of the song. You've got all that emotion that's heaving like an ocean, and you're drowning in a deep, dark well. I can hear it in your voice that if you only had a choice, you would rather be anyone else. I love you just the way that you are. I love the way he made your precious heart. Be kind to yourself. I know it's hard to hear it when the anger in your spirit is pointed like an arrow at your chest, when the voices in your mind are anything but kind, and you can't believe your Father knows best. I love you just the way that you are. I love the way he's shaping your heart. Be kind to yourself. Well, how does it end when the war that you're in is just you against you against you? You've got to learn to love your enemies too. I love how he takes that at the end, like Jesus' command to love your enemies, and how often have we made our greatest enemy ourself. Self-loathing in itself can become so focused in on itself that it becomes this twisted form of self-worship, that you're so consumed with yourself and your self-loathing that you're unable to see God's love for you and receive that, and in return, be able to access what it is that I want or desire that might be good that I might want to give to somebody else. Jesus isn't calling us to self-loathing. He's calling us to pay attention to ourselves, our wants, our desires, and our loves, so that we might be pulled through that space into a space of love for others. He uses the path of self-awareness, self-care, to lead us to other care. Scott McKnight jokingly talks about we should ditch the WWJD bracelets that you're all still wearing from the 1990s. I know, I've seen them all. They're just all over the place. He's like, maybe we should wear a WWIW bracelet to look down and say, not what would Jesus do, but what would I want? What would I want if I were this person? That Jesus is asking us to ask that question. And so it isn't selfishness, it isn't selfish, but it does require a level of self-awareness. And then lastly, my last observation on this. The golden rule isn't actually a rule. It's a vision. Here's what I mean by that. No one can spell out for you in detail what it looks like to treat others the way that you would want to be treated. No one else can tell you that. No one else can list all the possibilities, all the categories, all the circumstances, all the potential scenarios. No one can do that for you. No one can write that rule book for you in any way. That's the beauty of the simplicity of what Jesus is doing here. He's giving us a vision. The only way to access that reality is to envision it. Or maybe a better way of saying that is, you have to use your imagination. Jesus is saying you have to use your imagination. The only way to treat others the way you want to be treated is to imagine. Just stop in the moment and to think, I wonder what it would be like to be this person. And it literally pulls me out of myself, and I imagine myself in another self, and I wonder, how would I want to be treated in this situation? You see what I'm saying? But it isn't a rule. To turn this into a rule would be impossible. Jesus is giving us a vision that's requiring our imagination. My lovely wife earlier this year nudged me into taking on a leadership role with my neighborhood association, which has been the joy of my life. I had all these high hopes of it's going to be about creating relationships and community in the neighborhood and caring for people. And what I've learned is that people have a lot of time on their hands, and especially in my neighborhood, and so much time on our hands that we've gone back to these documents that were drafted in 1956, our CC&Rs, our codes and covenants and restrictions that are attached to the land. And there are specific things for our neighborhood that you can and can't do. And there's been some people studying these CC&Rs and beginning to pay attention to what's happening in the neighborhood and whether or not anybody and everybody is in compliance with these CC&Rs. And so an emergency meeting was called yesterday, and took some time out of my afternoon to jump in on this meeting, and the pitchforks were out, It was just kill the beast, we were just starting to chant because there was a neighbor that was very obviously out of compliance. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't abide by these things are good things in the end, but I found myself in the meeting, and as co-chair, president of the neighborhood association, there was a proposal to write a somewhat harsh, maybe even some people might call it a nasty letter to one of the neighbors about their non-compliance. And at one point in the meeting, I just simply asked, I wonder what it would feel like to get this letter. I wonder what it would feel like if we were the ones, or if I were the one getting this letter. And there was this collective pause, and then kind of this nodding. The wheels were turning. And it was kind of And we ended up going in a different direction. Still upholding the CC&Rs, of course, but the way in which we're delivering it a little bit differently. So you can applaud my abilities in neighborhood peacekeeping, but that is not the point of this. The point of this is, the power of the golden rule is that it's not a rule. It's a vision. It's an invitation to explore. The power is in, I wonder. Because that's a really expansive space. And what it does is it naturally pulls you out of yourself and puts you in this empathetic space. And it is that imaginative piece that opens up new possibilities for how to interact with each other. So Jesus is saying this is the way you love. This is what it looks like to love. This is what it looks like to love your neighbor, to imagine, if you were them, how you would want to be treated. When was the last time I can feel good about myself for having this wise, sagely response in the context of my neighborhood association when I've been thinking and writing and praying about this passage all week? Very good, Adam. Congratulations. But it's a whole other thing when last night I'm at Home Depot with my wife and my kids, which is my least favorite place to be with my children. I don't know why, but it's just they go crazy, just running up and down the aisles and pulling things. I don't know if it's everything that's at their height, but they're just pulling things down. And we're looking at recessed lighting and trying to have a real conversation about what should we do with this and what size do we need here. And the kids are just like, "Wah!" And I'm slowly ramping up. And my kids are getting louder and I'm getting louder and I'm snapping at them. And then all of a sudden I'm speaking to my wife. She's like, "Why are you, let's go home. Why are you talking to me that way?" And I just had to take a deep breath, and I'm like, so as easy as it could be, giving the sage advice, it's extremely difficult to live continually in the imaginative space of how is this feeling for this other person? What does it feel like for my wife when I've got this level of agitation and that's the way that I'm speaking to her? When was the last time we're mid-argument with a family member or spouse or friend or somebody that you're close enough to actually fight with that you stopped for a minute and took a second to imagine, I wonder how they're feeling. I wonder what it'd feel like to be them right now. It's not a golden rule, it's a golden vision. Jesus gave us much more than a moral code. He gave us an imaginative landscape to explore and run through. And he's inviting us to a more expansive world than the law could ever do in its greatest detail. So the golden rule isn't negative, it's positive. It isn't passive, but requires action. It isn't an investment, it's a gift. It isn't selfish, but it does require self-awareness. And it actually isn't a rule. It's a vision that requires our imagination. But the saying doesn't end there. Jesus goes on to say this, "For this is the law and the prophets." What is the significance of this? Jesus is saying there's two ways to kind of approach the law. There's the multiplication of laws, which we actually see in the Bible itself. It starts out with the 10 Commandments. Here, this is enough. Oh, you obviously don't get these 10. So I'm going to make some more. And so there's this expanding of the law. And the Pharisees came in and said, there's these 150, and we need to build some hedges around these laws, and so we're going to create hundreds, thousands more laws so that we can protect these ones that are all the way in the middle. And it just becomes this kind of impossible situation. Jesus' response is to reduce it. Not to multiply the law, but to reduce it, to sum it up. And to say, this is the entirety of the law and the prophets. Everything is contained in this. And this isn't the only time that Jesus says this. He says it, I've already mentioned in the Great Commandment in Matthew 22, where he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Because on this hangs or depends the entirety of the law and the prophets. So, a couple questions that I think are important for us to explore. What's the point of the law and the prophets? We don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to cut straight to it. The point of the law was to distinguish the people of God from other nations as a people who knew what it looked like to operate under the rule and the reign of a God that loved them and cared for them. And then to extend that love that God gave to this nation and be a blessing to all the nations, to all the world, that they might know God's love in the way that they treated the other nations, the other people. That was the point of the law. The point of the prophets was a response to failing the law. So Israel walks away from the law. God sends the prophets to come and to speak words of return. Hey, it's okay. You messed up. Come back. Come back to God, because God is gracious and compassionate. He's slow to anger. He's abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. For generations, God is welcoming you home. The purpose of the law and the prophets, the combined purpose of the law and the prophets, was to point to the love of God. I think sometimes we get mixed up in that. Like that somehow it was just these gates or these standards or these codes. But the point of these things was the love of God. That the law and the prophets would expose us to God's love for us and what it looks like to live under his reign and rule here in the world. Did they accomplish this? Cliff notes. Answer real quick. No. They didn't. The law didn't fulfill it because Israel could never keep it. Israel could never live it out. Israel could not obey the law. And the prophets certainly didn't do it because the words of the prophets just fall on deaf ears over and over and over and again. And God's going, I'm going to come and I'm going to show you in the form of Hosea, and I'm going to come and I'm going to show you in the form of Isaiah and Jeremiah. And it didn't matter in what way he tried to show them what it looked like to turn from their ways and to come back. They didn't. So why bring this up? Because this is, I think, the linchpin here for us. Because Jesus has already said something important in the Sermon on the Mount, we got to go back to it. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 says this. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, at first glance, we can look at this and say, Jesus is just saying he's going to keep all the law. He's going to do all the good things. And he does. But that isn't the essence of what Jesus is saying here. What the law and the prophets could not do, fulfill their purpose of conveying the love of God to the world, I am going to do. I am going to fulfill that. I'm going to be its culmination, its crescendo in this message of God that I've been trying to get across from the beginning. That Jesus is going to be the clearest and most perfect example of the message that God has been trying to get across to the world, which is, I love you. Come home. I care about you. I'm thinking about you. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, I'm thinking about you. Like God thinks about me. Like God doesn't think about me. I'm just a worm. Like hold on a second. We see this pattern in the life of Jesus. Like Jesus, in his suffering, in his agony, in his death on the cross, what's he doing? I can point to 3 instances. He's thinking about other people. In the midst of his suffering and his death, where any one of us would cave in on ourselves and on our own pain and on our own pity, Jesus is caring for others. He's saying to the thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. He's bringing comfort to the man who's dying next to him. And one of my favorite, and I think kind of misunderstood examples, when he says from the cross to his mother and to John, this is now your son, this is now your mother. What's he doing there? He's caring for them. They're going to need each other. And he's saying, I'm not going to be able to be the son anymore. And so here's your son. Here's your mother. He's dying, he's thinking about other people. And in probably the most mind-boggling one of all, Jesus, from the cross, is thinking about the very people who are killing him, who are beating him, flogging him, and hanging him on a cross. And he's saying, Father, forgive these people. And he's claiming ignorance on their behalf. They don't even know, they have no idea what they're doing. They have no clue. So you say, I don't know if God thinks about me. I don't know if God cares about me. Jesus came to fulfill the law and the prophets. Jesus came to communicate what those things could not communicate, which is God loves you. And I think for us to come to that reality for us at a deeply personal level, Jesus loves us most when he puts himself in our shoes. when he walks the road of temptation that we face, when he suffers the pains that we suffer, when he takes the blows that we deserve, when he dies the death that we've chosen for ourselves, God himself saves us by putting himself in our shoes, by fulfilling the golden rule. And then he calls us to follow him in this path. This is where this shifts from all other golden rules that exist in the world. This is not a pithy proverb. My role, the thing that I'm dedicated to vocationally, doesn't set me apart from anyone else. There's a priesthood of believers here. We're all actually called to this in some way or another. Our role in each other's lives is not to motivate each other to be nice and better people. That is not the point of what we do here. It's not to send you from this place with a little helping of guilt, enough to kind of kick you in the rear end, and then a little dose of inspiration so you feel a little pumped up like you went to a Tony Robbins thing, and then a little pat on the back, and a hope and a prayer, and gosh, I hope you can be a better person this week. I hope you can just pull it off. Is not what I'm called to, is not what we're called to for each other. What we are called to do is to speak the gospel, which just means good news. When we come to this and say, what is the good news? I think there's a lot of good news here, but this is the good news I want to speak this morning. The good news is the work isn't in going and trying to be better. There's a whole world that's doing that, and we're seeing the fruit of it. Go try to be better. The work isn't bearing down into the rule. The work isn't in bearing down into the law. It's in bearing down into the one who fulfilled the law for us. It's in bearing down into the love of God. I love how Paul prays it in Ephesians, and we pray this prayer in our spiritual formation groups at the beginning of every single one of our groups, and I've come to love it, especially in this translation. This is what it says. I pray that from his glorious unlimited resources, that he will empower you with inner strength through the Spirit. Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust him, and your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. And may you have the power to understand, as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, and how deep his love is. May you experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to fully understand. Then you will be made complete with all the fullness of life and power that comes from God. The message this morning isn't go and make yourself complete. Go and make yourself the person that obeys the golden rule in all scenarios. Paul's prayer and my prayer and the good news this morning is to bear down into the love of God, to let your roots go down deep. And that is the only way. That is the only way we will ever know how to love anyone else. That is the only way our imaginations will expand. That is the only way that we'll have any clue about love, is to be people who have received the love of God and who are doing the work of trying to plumb its depths, of saying, how far does it go this way? And how far does it go this way? And how far does it go this way? And to trying to see how big it is for us. If there is any work to give ourselves to and to strive for, that's the work. That's the work, and that's the invitation this morning. I totally get it if you're like, that sounds good. I don't know. We value at Union Chapel, we think that when we bring our reality to the reality of Jesus and we say, I don't know. I'm not really sure. The invitation this morning is to bring that skepticism, to bring that doubt, to Jesus, because we believe that what happens there is that Jesus meets us there. We were just saying this last week, seek and you will find, that Jesus' promises. You come looking for it, I'm going to meet you with my reality in the midst of your reality. But you have to come with your honesty. So the invitation this morning is to come and receive God's love if you've never received God's love before. We share this communion table every week during worship. People come and they take this bread and they dip it in this wine. It isn't just this religious ritual as much as it is us entering into a physical experience that Jesus left for us as a physical reminder of his love for us, of his generosity towards us, of the way in which he fulfilled that message of love towards us. And if you come here every week, and you come to this table every week, the invitation is still the same. But the invitation is to try and wake up to the reality that you don't understand God's love. I don't understand God's love. I don't know how far it goes this way, or how far it goes this way. There's always new territory in our souls that need to experience the extravagant love of God. So that invitation is here for you as well, to come and eat, to come and drink, to come and be filled with the love of God, that in some way his Spirit might dwell in us and go with us and be deeply rooted in our hearts, that we might have some hope of living this love to the world. Let's pray.